Hello, everyone. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Gerald Elias, a man of many talents. He is also a distinguished musician and an accomplished author. Born on Long Island, Gerald began playing the violin at age 7. His musical journey led him to study with acclaimed teachers, including Ivan Galamian and former Boston Symphony concertmaster Joseph Silverstein. After graduating from Yale, he joined the Boston Symphony's violin section in 1975. In 1988, Gerald became the Associate Concertmaster for the Utah Symphony, a position he held for over 2 decades. During his time in Utah, he was deeply involved in the local music community as a faculty member at the University of Utah, as a quartet violinist, and the music director for the Vivaldi by Candlelight series. Gerald's creative pursuits extend beyond music. In 2009, he published his first mystery novel, Devil's Trill, which became Barnes& Noble Discover Great New Writers selection. He has since published 7 more novels in the same series, along with other works of fiction and nonfiction. Gerald, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Of course. Now, for the first question, and this is a bit of a loaded question, from a global perspective, how has music historically been used as a tool of diplomacy and cultural exchange between nations?
To answer that, I'd like to speak from personal experience going back to when I was in high school. You mentioned I grew up on Long Island, and in high school, I was a member of the Long Island Youth Orchestra. That orchestra was conducted by someone who had been professionally trained as a musician named Martin Dreiwitz, but his career was as a travel agent. And he took it upon himself every summer to schedule an international tour for the orchestra. So year after year for quite a few years, but into the 1970s, I had the opportunity to travel with the Long Island Youth Orchestra to Europe, the South Pacific, New Zealand and Australia, Japan, you name it. And most of the time on those tours, we stayed with host families. And that kind of exchange where you actually get to live with a family and learn something about the culture that's totally new to you was revelatory for me and was the beginning of my passion for using music as a means of creating international friendship and understanding. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I value Utah global diplomacy so much and my association with it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response. And I think that what you're describing, citizen diplomacy, is such a vital part of that interaction between nations. And as you were saying, in this case, it was music for you. And for you to have gone through so many countries, I think that's just amazing, quite frankly.
I should
So,
I should just add that some of the friends that I made back in the mid 70s, I'm still friends with
wow.
in Japan and Australia and New Zealand. So
Mhm.
these are long lasting and very deep relationships.
Which brings me to my next question. It's a great timing. Could you share examples of how these exchanges with music have helped foster goodwill or mutual understanding in recent years, or in this case, decades?
Sure. I was a violinist in the Boston Symphony from 1975 through 88 before coming to Utah. And in 1979, the Boston Symphony was invited to go to China at a very critical juncture in Chinese history. It was right at the end of the Cultural Revolution, and we were the first American symphony orchestra to visit there after the reopening. Now, for those who don't remember that Cultural Revolution, Western music was banned. Chinese musicians who performed Western music were either imprisoned or sent out into the countryside to be laborers. Many of them had to hide their music and their instruments until the end of the Cultural Revolution. So that when we were invited to China, it was very significant, both in terms of musical diplomacy and international diplomacy. That was when Deng Xiaoping took over the country and really opened up the economy and cultural institutions. In fact, when we flew there to Beijing from Boston, we were on the first 747 that ever flew to China, which is a little
Wow.
tidbit of history.
Mm.
But when we got there, what we found was this really unexpected openness among the people who came to our concerts. We were treated like rock stars, and we had one concert at the end of this. It was a very short trip of only about 7 or 8 days, a joint concert with the Beijing Philharmonic. We played Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and our music director at that time, Seiji Ozawa, was the conductor. And what was wonderful about that joint performance was that each of the musicians in the Boston Symphony got to sit next to one of the musicians from the Beijing Philharmonic. And I happened to be lucky enough to sit next to a very pretty young lady who was so enthusiastic that she ended up not only coming to the US to study violin, but she became a member of the St. Louis Symphony. So that opening was not only for the greater good of world politics, unfortunately, it hasn't lasted totally, but it created this awareness and friendship and understanding between members of the society of each country.
Thank you for that, and that's beautiful. That leads me into the next segue, which is what role does music play in diplomacy that traditional politics or economic channels cannot? You're speaking of something that combines humans together, right? Putting them together and enjoying something that as a medium is non-controversial, right?
I think one of the things that should be mentioned is that in American symphony orchestras, it's probably the best example of the melting pot, which is so unique about the United States. When I joined the Boston Symphony in 1975, many of the musicians were from Europe, having fled Europe before World War II and were still members of the orchestra. Later on, we received musicians from the Soviet Union who were fleeing persecution there. These days, most symphony orchestras have a large contingent of musicians from Asia, primarily China, Korea, and Japan, who have come to the US to play in American orchestras simply because the orchestras here are so great and so welcoming to people from around the world. And of course, all these musicians have to work together. And it's not like, let's say, someone who works for a major tech company who does all their work remotely with people around the world. There's something to be said for that. But we're talking about people from all around the world sitting on the stage together, working together every day in a very intricate and complex manner, and really learning how to get along and create relationships there. So that's a form of, I would say, indirect music diplomacy, but I think there's something very important about that.
Perfect. And thank you so much for that. And with that in mind, with your experiences that you've already explained, what are some other examples throughout the years that you have seen personally or maybe indirectly music diplomacy working its magic around international politics? So, for example, we think of the Beatles and how they went from across countries. They were a major pop icon. So, in this case, do you think that you have any examples that you could think of that play a similar role in diplomacy?
I would say that our current government has made a concerted effort to, how should I say this, take our long-term friends and make them into our, I don't want to say enemies, but adversaries. You mentioned the Beatles tours. One of the positive things about orchestral tours is that when we play a concert in a different city every day for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, we get to meet people. We get to meet not only other musicians, we get to meet the people who work in the hotels, who work in the tourist industry, who work in the restaurants, and really have a chance to relate to them. When I was in the Utah Symphony, we had a tour. I forgot what year it was, but we went to Europe and we spent 3 days, which is a long time to spend in one city, in Nuremberg, Germany. And with our schedule, the best place for us to eat pragmatically was in the hotel restaurant, which happened to have a very good Italian restaurant right in the hotel. And so we ate dinner there for 3 nights in a row. And the first night, we started talking to the waiter and the chef, who happened to be from Sicily. And they were a fun bunch of guys. And each night we were there, they would bring us a better bottle of wine. And the food got better and better until we were really friendly with these guys. And I was kind of sad to leave. But those little things are very meaningful. And so when we have a chance to tour like that and meet all these people, even on a very superficial level, it says to people around the world that Americans can be pretty nice folks and that the relationships among just members of the public between countries really has a breaking effect on some of the more divisive political issues. And I think that shouldn't be underestimated either. And there's one other aspect that I'd like to talk about in terms of touring, which are the audiences. If we play in Germany or if we play in Eastern Europe or in Asia, we get thousands of people every night to come to our concerts. And they appreciate what we do because I'm speaking now mainly about the Boston Symphony because Utah Symphony hasn't toured very much. But Boston Symphony touring, it's a very deep experience with an orchestra that great playing incredible music for the audience. And for many of these people, it will be the only time in their lives that they get to hear the Boston Symphony live. So the impact of a concert like that really extends beyond the moment. And maybe 20 years from now, someone in Korea or Japan will say, yeah, I remember that concert. Those musicians were incredible. So it does have a very lasting effect. I don't know whether it has much effect on the world of politics or policy, but I know among people it's very, very important.
Thank you for that. And I do agree. When we talk about the impact of music, it's a uniting factor rather than a dividing one. And so this leads me to my next question, which is, in what ways do visiting international artists and music festivals in Utah do they strengthen the state's global connections? In what ways?
I haven't lived in Utah since 2011. My answer to that is going to be a bit perfunctory, but clearly when guest artists, conductors, musicians, people in any aspect of the cultural world come to Utah, I know for one that they're treated in a very friendly manner, in a very courteous and gracious and generous manner. And that doesn't even start talking about what an incredible place Utah is in terms of its geography and geology. It's so spectacular. And even though I only get to go back to Utah once or twice a year these days, we always just marvel in some of the places that we like to visit. In fact, this fall, I'm hoping to take a road trip to central Utah or Moab area. I'm not sure exactly where yet, because we love Seattle and it has a spectacular environment there, but so different from Utah. And we do miss being in the desert. There's something very special and unique about that. So, yeah, when guest artists come to the US and are treated in such a generous and friendly manner and get to see some of the wonders of the state, I'm sure they go home and have very positive things to say.
Thank you for that. And I acknowledge that it has been some time for you since you lived in Utah. So I imagine this next question, it might be a little based on your personal experience. But what opportunities do you see for Utah's younger musicians and musical students who would want to engage in cross-cultural or international music exchanges?
Yeah, that's a tougher one. I have to think about that for a moment. There are some really wonderful youth orchestras in the Salt Lake area, one of which has been conducted by Barb Scowcroft, violinist in the Utah Symphony for many years, and she's done wonderful things about it. Of course, the cultural exchanges that involve students have to be very carefully planned long in advance and are very expensive these days, the travel and accommodations, things like that. There are a couple of other string organizations in the Salt Lake area. Rocky Mountain Strings, I believe, went to Italy last spring, and that was for them maybe a once in a lifetime experience. And the director of that, Leslie Henry, is a former student of mine and is the concertmaster of the Vivaldi by Candlelight Chamber Orchestra. So I was very thrilled to see that she was able to manage a tour like that for students, because I think if there's one thing that I think should be mentioned about Utah is that traditionally it's been somewhat insulated from the outside world, except of course for the missionaries that are sent all over the place. But culturally, I think there's a sense that the outside world is something of a question mark. And the ability for young people to travel abroad, get to know people of their own age, other students, intermingle with them, and experience life in other parts of the world is really invaluable. And I would just hope that those kinds of cultural exchanges continue. Now, as one of the great things about Utah Global Diplomacy are the youth programs that it's initiated, bringing young people from around the world to Salt Lake City and Utah to experience what it's like. And when we lived in Salt Lake City, we were fortunate enough to host some of the adult cultural exchange visitors and have maintained relationships with some of them as well. So my feeling is that the more we learn about the world and the more the world learns about us, the better off everyone is.
And thank you for that beautiful response, Gerald. And that does bring me to one of my last questions for today. And I want to refer back to Vivaldi by Candlelight, which I believe that you're the music director for an event in this December in the Salt Lake area. When it comes down to the audience and it comes down to international citizen diplomacy, what is something that you would wish for your audience to know about the musical pieces that you'll be playing that night? And how would you hope that music plays out for people who may be coming from all over the world?
Good question. I think when people come to concerts and hear music by some of the composers we perform, Vivaldi or Bach or Corelli or any number of composers, it all seems like ancient history. But those composers, they live day to day. They had to make a living. They had to stay warm enough where they lived to be able to write. They had to have enough light. And we try to give our audience a personal experience. That's one of the reasons we perform in some of the venues we have over the years, and make it more than just, okay, buy a ticket, go to a concert, have dinner, go home, a fun night out. We try to give a sense of what the music means in terms of society, in terms of the performers back in the day in the 1700s who played the exact same music, and how did they tune their instruments and where did they get their strings from and all those kinds of things. So it's really a connection that's made not only in space in terms of the stage to the audience, but in terms of time, from today all working our way back to the 1700s, 1600s, wherever it takes us. So what we aim to do, and hope we've succeeded, is to give this experience of a richness and personal communication between the musicians, the audience, the composers. That really is makes for a special event.
Perfect. Thank you. And I promise you that based off of this conversation alone, I wish we had way more time because I think I would have so many questions about your vision, about the concert, your kind of design, about how it goes to not only entertain an audience, but also potentially inspire an audience. For me, growing up, I did not have much exposure to classical music, but just by listening to you, I'm more than inclined to go and attend this concert and to learn
You
more.
better come. I'm going to keep my eye out for you there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
I've got more. I've got more time. If you want to have more time, it's up to
oh
you.
yeah. But yeah, I can definitely go a few more minutes. So one of my last questions is when it comes to misconceptions about classical music, I'm from a different era than you are, and I'm from a different generation than you are. I think that growing up, I was not very much exposed to classical music. So do you feel that there is a misconception or a misperception generationally about music that you would like to clarify?
I don't think it's so much generational. I think it's really the environment in which we're brought up. And I mentioned that because these days there are more classical music students going to universities and conservatories than ever, literally thousands. When I grew up, my parents never played an instrument. I have an older brother and sister who did play the violin and piano, but my father was a great music lover, and he had the LPs playing every day. And by the time do you know what an LP is?
I do not.
Do you know what a record is?
I do.
Okay, yeah, LP stands for long playing. They were records that could play for a half hour per side. And that was the standard on turntables with hi-fi, all that kind of
Mm.
stuff. So even by the time I started playing the violin when I was 7 or 8, I knew what music was supposed to sound like. Classical music was supposed to sound like. So it was a big advantage to me. And these days, I would say in the US, even though the availability of classical music is universal and so easy on YouTube, or there's so many streaming sites where you can listen to anything, but I don't think as many people are invested in classical music. One reason being it's really not taught very much in public schools anymore. It used to be part and parcel of any kind of public education to learn about music, not only in general, but classical music specifically. That's missing. And I think that's something that has to be remedied. I know that a lot of orchestras are trying to extend their outreach programs and connections with schools in order to do that because they don't want to see audiences drying up. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really important. Another thing is societal shifts. I mentioned before how many musicians are coming from Asia these days to play in American orchestras. I think there's been a real shift in the passion and enthusiasm for classical Western music that has shifted to Asia, and not only Asia, but to South America as well. I don't think there's been much of a change in Europe. I mean, that there's always been a very stable appreciation of classical music there. But times change, cultures change. And I think one of the positives is that if you look at any community, any city of any size, you'll find youth orchestras, community orchestras, semi-professional orchestras, maybe not full-time professional orchestras. There is this hierarchy of music performance, classical music performance, that I think should give us some cause for optimism for the future.
Perfect. And with that, Gerald, that does come up at the end of our time. I just wanted to say thank you so much for all of your responses and your insights as to how beautiful music is and what it does for diplomacy as a whole. So with that, I again thank you.
Thanks for having me, and I look forward to seeing you on December 6th.
Of course, Gerald.